Happy New Year everyone and welcome to another video. Now that 2023 is over, I can finally analyze all of the Title Tuesday tournaments that are hosted every Tuesday in 2 events with a $5,000 prize pool at chess.com. In these tournaments, some of the best players in the world play against one another in 11 rounds and 3-minute blitz games with 1 extra second per move. And you will find some of the most beloved YouTube and Twitch streamers and chess content creators participating there. Let us go over the structure quickly. Only players with a title are allowed to participate, and there is an early and a late event. The Swiss format guarantees that in later rounds players with similar score will face each other so that the winner had to beat other players of similar levels and performance on that day. In the first weeks, tiebreaks were resolved by the Buchholz cut, but after that, they are now resolved with the Sonneberg score, where you add up the score of all the players that you beat during the tournament, and you add half the score for each draw you got against a certain opponent. In part 1 of the video, I will go over some tournament-specific analysis and results to show you how many players participate on average and how many games they play, what score you need to win and where most players come from, as well as the titles they have and their blitz ratings. In part 2, I will analyze which player won the most tournament and which participated the most. We will find out who achieved the perfect score, winning all 11 games, and who won both tournaments on the same day, as well as figuring out who had the longest participation and winning streak, what prize money they won, and how many games they win with white or black pieces. Just a brief description of the setup steps. I basically downloaded all 103 tournament CSV files that hold the results and the game information, and then I used some R functions to read those in automatically and merge the different datasets row-wise, leading to a Title Tuesday data frame called TT with over 40,000 rows. I had to do quite a bit of data cleaning because some users had different titles or countries throughout the years and the real names were sometimes missing. But in the end I could create a specific player data frame that holds the average information of these players that participated in multiple tournaments, and we will use that in the second part of the video. So without further ado, let's get started with the R code. Let's begin with tournament-specific results, which is also a good starting point to understand the different variables of the dataset, like the score, federation, title, and rating of the different players. I stored the Title Tuesday data frame in an object called TT, and with the view function, you can inspect all of the data in this preview table. We have almost 50,000 rows and many columns that hold the different variables. I imported one CSV file for each tournament, and the number tells you which place a certain player accomplished. So the first tournament in 2023 was won by Jan Duda, who plays for the Polish Federation and is a Grandmaster with a blitz rating of 3000. And then there's information of all the 11 games the players had from round 1 till round 11. And you can see that in round 9, he had a draw against the second placed player, Hikaru, playing with black. So Hikaru Nakamura, playing with white, faced the number 1 and also played the draw. And then in round 10, he won with black against player number 18, which is Vladimir Fedoseev, who then by this logic had to lose with white against player number 1. So that's how this information is stored. Then you have a score. So if you win, you get 1 point. For a draw, you get half a point. And if there's a draw in points, it is resolved by the Buchholz cut, where you add up the score of the players you faced during the tournament, minus the lowest placed player. So if during your 11 rounds you encounter players that themselves have high scores at the end of the tournament, your Buchholz cut increases. But sometimes players are still tied and then they get the same place. So Alexei Sarana and Magnus Carlsen both placed 16 with a final score of 8 and an identical Buchholz cut. You can use the str function to learn something about the structure of your data frame, tells you how many variables there are and how many rows, and then gives you a preview of the data and tells you whether it's numeric, a character value, or whether it comes as a factor with certain levels. And the dim function tells you the dimensions of your data. So again, 48,000 rows. And the first question I have is, how many tournaments were played in 2023? And since I loaded each tournament with a specific CSV file, you can ask how many of these file names are unique. And then you see that 103 different files were imported, indicating whether it's a late or early tournament and when exactly it happened. You could then additionally use the length function to see that this vector of unique file names has a length of 103. And if you want to use dplyr functions from the tidyverse, you could ask how many distinct file names there are and get the same value. Now, if we count date and time, where time indicates whether it's an early or late tournament, for each date we get the number of players that played in this tournament, and we see that for January 24th, the early tournament is missing. In case you wondered why we only have 103 tournaments, if there are 2 each week, we should have 104. And the reason was that early last year, the servers from chess.com couldn't keep up with the increased traffic and they had to cancel one tournament. And the prize money from the tournament was then moved towards the early event of the next week. Now, we got lucky that it was cancelled in January, but if this happened at another time during the year, one way to find out which tournament was missing is to count the date again after the first count of date and time, and then filter for the new n equal to 1. So then you can find the date even if it's not shown in the first 10 lines of the results. Next, I wanted to know how many players participate in each tournament. So every file name came with a certain number of rows representing an individual player. So we could count the existence of these different names. Another way to do it is to count date and time and then split that into a wide format with pivot wider, where the values come from the n column, but the additional column names will come from the time column. And then it looks like this. So now for each week, we know how many players played in the early or in the late tournament. You could also use the summarize function to calculate the average, minimum and maximum of these early and late tournaments. Don't forget to group by the time variable to get separate results. And then you could already see that the early tournament usually has more players participating than the late one. And if you visualize the number of participants by counting the file name and then use a geom histogram, you see that this looks like a bimodal distribution, and therefore we should use the time information to color code the histogram. By default, it will stack the different bars on top. You could change the position argument to dodge and then you get them side by side, but there are even better options. For example, using facet rep versus the time variable and then using 2 rows to differentiate early versus late tournaments. And you could also use the geom density function to include both tournaments into one chart, early versus late, and then have a direct comparison. If you use geom call versus date on the x-axis and number of participants on the y-axis, you could see how stable the number of participants are for a certain tournament. Next, I wanted to know how many games are played on average by the different participants, and you remember that this information was stored in the round columns. And one thing you would notice if you look into lower placements of the tournament, that sometimes you see a U -- appear instead of the 1 with black against 306 player. And this means that this player did not play round 1 to 7. Maybe they arrived late and they missed the first round and then played 3 games and stopped playing. So this U -- tells you that someone did not play a game, which means that if we only look into the columns with the round information and we count how often this U -- does not appear, we will get the number of games played for each participant. So when you use the grep function and ask for the column name including R&D, you will see 9 to 19 are the columns that we would need. You can include that for the column information and use it on all the rows of your TT data frame. And then we simply have to create a new column called games played for each player for each tournament. And what we can then do is use the count function to count out of all tournaments how often a player played all of the games or just one and anything in between. So what I did here, I eliminated all the players that did not play a single game in a tournament. In my sense, these players did not actually participate, so I excluded them from the original data frame. You could also use the table function from the base R package to get these results. And when I look into the backup data, there are still the 954 cases where players did not play a single game. You can turn this into a histogram again to see how common it is to actually play all 11 games. You could also use the geom bar function, which will go through all of the numbers and tell you how often they appear. So one game played 2,213 times. And based on the count of games played, you could also use games played on the x-axis and n on the y-axis and then use geom call to get the same result as the geom bar. Another thing we could do is go through the rounds column-wise to check how many players participated in each round. So is it 90% that start playing the first game, but then only 50% make it to the very end? And now we don't use row sums or column sums, but col means. So this condition asking whether a value is u dash dash will give you trues and false, and a true in R is a 1 and false is a 0, and when you build the mean or average of true and false, you get a percentage. So the mean of the vector true, true, false should be 2/3. So across all of the tournaments, round 1 were played by 89% of participants, and round 2 was actually the most common played, probably because some people missed the start, but then towards the end, round 11 is only played by 53% of the players. So you can turn this information into a data frame where you just have one column with round 1 to 11 and then the percent playing that we just calculated. And if you pipe this data frame into the ggplot function where you put percent playing on the y-axis and the different rounds on the x-axis, you can add a label from the scales package using the label percent function to get this text, and then you add the geom text to the chart, color white with a certain vertical adjustment, and this way you learn that a vast majority of players plays the first 4 rounds, but then it declines towards the end. And we can create a similar chart for the games played information, where we saw that almost half of the players play all of the games, so 46% play 11 games, and with the geom bar function and some geom text that automatically calculates the percentages, you can produce this chart with the percent values attached. Now this 46% number is across all 103 tournaments. That's the overall average. We could, however, group by date and time and calculate this percentage for each individual tournament with using the summarize function. We can ask how many games are played on average and median, and how often is the games played value 11, so all games played. And then you can see average is a bit more than 8 games, sometimes lower than 8, median 10, sometimes 11, 9, and around 50%, sometimes below 40. Let's put that into a chart. So we could ask how many games are played on average and then plot the mean, but it's not very easy to compare. So then I was interested in only the percentage of players per tournament that played all 11 games. And here it's actually advised to use the geomLine function to put this percentage into the same chart, showing early and late in different colors. And then you can see that the early tournaments not only have more players, but the ones that are participating also play most of the games more often. So you could group by time and then use summarize again to get to the exact value. And overall, for early tournaments, 48% of participants play all games and 44% in the late tournament. So now I wanted to know what's the average score to win, so we can filter the tournaments by number 1 only, and we see the different winners. Let's only look into a subset of the different columns to have it expand a bit more, and we see that Hikaru won in January 3 weeks in a row, 17th, 24th and 31st of January, with a score of 9.5. Playing all games, still have the rating, and here you get a first impression at 10 points, 9.5 gives you the win. We can turn that into a histogram, where we now see that sometimes players had 11 points for the perfect score, sometimes you could win with 9 points, but the majority of wins, relatively speaking, came with 9.5 points and then 10 points. If we include the time variable for the color, which is the fill argument within geom histogram, you can see that these 2 perfect scores happened in the late tournament, and then it's probably not a statistically significant difference between early and late what score you need to win. Maybe with early tournaments having more players and also playing all of the games with a higher percentage, the 10 points score becomes more crucial to actually winning the tournament. But when you look at the average score needed to win, it doesn't look like a significant difference. So we can look further into the lowest score to win, filtering for a score of 9 and placing number 1, which was done by vachier-lagrave and Dmitry Andreikin in April and in August. And if you filter the data for these specific dates, you see that the score of 9 points was done by 8 players, which all technically finished first, but giving the Buchholz cut, where you get more points when you faced better opponents during the tournament, Maxim won this tournament with only 9 points. And even more extreme was the 9-point win in August, because here 12 players finished first, having 9 points, and Mahdi Orimi from Iran only played 10 games, so he could have won with another draw in the 11th game, but here Dmitry Andreikin won with 9 points and a huge draw. Which actually brings me to the next question. It ties in perfectly. How often is the first place tied with other players having the same score, and what is the most common tie? So these extreme cases are really rare, but tying for first place probably isn't. So let's look into it. We can group by file name, so all 103 tournaments, and filter for the situation where the score is equal to the max score, which means that the early first tournament in January only had number 1, but then the late tournament had number 1, 2, and 3 with the same score of 9.5. So this was a 3-player tie between 2 German players and 1 from Iran, but then the next 2 tournaments only had one number 1 with the highest score. So if we filter for the scores that are identical to the max score and then count the file names, we see how many players tied for the maximum score of first place with this unusual 12 in August, and then often no ties but a single player with the highest score. We can count n again to get a summary, and then we see that out of 103 tournaments, 56 times no tie, but a single player with the highest score. 28 times 2 players, identical highest score. These 12 and 8 only happened once, but a 4-player tie happened 5 times and 3 players 12 times. And now we can chart this using geom_col, showing the different number of ties or the single user bar. If you want to look into these tournaments, you could count the score again after grouping by date and time, and then arrange by descending ends to find out when these draws happened. The one from August and April we already looked at, but now you could further investigate the 9.5 scores where 4 players tied in 5 different tournaments, etc. Then I was curious whether these ties differ by time, and the percent winning without a tie seems to be pretty stable, around 54%. 2-player ties are a bit more common in the late tournaments with 34% versus 19.6. The 3-player ties are then very close again, around 10%, and the 4-player ties did not happen in the late tournament. So maybe that's explained by earlier tournaments having more players playing more games, which could then lead to bigger ties. If you analyze the average score for these different situations of no tie versus 2-player tie and 3-player tie, which you can do with different groupings, counting and summarizing, you will see that on average, winning alone, you would have a score of 10, sometimes 11, but then 9.5 points often lead to 2 or 3 or 4 players tying, and these crazy big ties can only happen with 9 points. Speaking of the cases where 9.5 was enough to win untied, you could filter for them and then get the date when it actually happened. So 14 times this occurred. Out of the 56 times, someone won without a challenger for first place. And here would be the details for these 14 tournaments, where you can see Hikaru winning with 9.5 times, and the second place only has 9 points. That happened quite often. And winning alone with 9.5 times can be nice, but let's look into the cases where someone won with the perfect score. This happened only twice in 2023 by Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in July and August late tournaments. And when we look into these tournaments, we see that the second place did not even come close to 11 points. So Magnus won perfect game here. And the same for Hikaru. 11 points weren't really necessary because second best place only got 9 points. Next, I want to look into the country information or the federation to find out where the participants come from. And just as an example, I go back to the uncleaned backup data, group by username and federation, add account and ungroup, and then use the example names to make the following point. Sometimes the flag that players choose is quite different from their actual federation. So Anish Giri chose Gambia, Christopher Yu, Papua New Guinea. And one player, for example, Maxim Omariev, participated multiple times with different flags. Nihal Sarin from India played with Chile and Tanzania, and therefore for some of these players I took the liberty to change the federation. For Nihal Sarin to India, for Maxim to Russia, Christopher Yu to the US, Anish Giri to the Netherlands. Alexander Botnik moved with his family from the Ukraine to the US, living there and streaming there, so I kept it US based. And for Vladimir Fedoseev, who some tournaments played under the flag of West Samoa. He chose Slovenia, and it was actually a news article where he, originally from Russia, said he wants to play under the Slovenian Federation. So I kept that, but changed the times when he played for West Samoa. I overwrote this to Slovenia. Based on the player data frame, I created a new variable that lumps together all countries that are not part of the top 30 countries. So this is unique players and their federation. What proportion comes from the United States, Russia, India, etc. So the top 30 federations make up 3/4 of the pie, and then there are 147 other countries that account for 25% of the players. And with the plotly function, you can make an interactive pie where you can hover over the slice to get some extra information. And this category, international, not a country, but it's a federation you can choose if you don't want to represent a unique country, and it comes in with 2% of the players. So one thing that interested me was whether there is a time difference when it comes to the federations that participate in the early versus late tournament. And here I filtered out the top 15 federations, excluding INT for international, and then with the country code function from the same named package, you can get proper names of the top 15 nations. And now I want to build an area chart that shows what percentage of the top 15 federations participate in the early versus late tournaments. So I created a placeholder data frame that has the file name and the date and time information. So we can join these two columns later to the data frame that I create now, where we count file name and federation. So for each tournament, we know how many people from Armenia or Azerbaijan played at this date. Then once we group by file name, we can add a count to this result, including a weight by N. And now we know that in this tournament, 477 participants played, which we can use to calculate the percentage, which means these 12 players from Argentina represent 2.5% of all the players. Then we filter for our top 15 federations and join the early versus late information based on the file name, which means that now we have for each date split by early versus late the percentage of our top 15 nations participating. In one more step, we add the country name again with the country code function. And now based on this data, I grouped by country, calculated the overall average percentage, and then arranged by descending average, which tells me that overall the percentage for the United States is the highest, followed by Russia, Poland, Spain. We can repeat the same for filtering the time to early and late. And now in the early tournaments, India should come up a bit earlier, giving the geographics and the time zones, and Canada is less common. And this order we will use for the chart by creating 3 new columns, country early, late, and total. And now we can pipe this data into the ggplot function after filtering for early using fill country order from the early vector, and then use the geom area function. And this means that for the early tournament, you get the following order: Russia first, then the United States, and this over the whole year of 2023. It also shows you that these top 15 countries represent around 60% of all the participants. And now if you repeat that for filtering by late, one thing you notice is that the top country always gets this color. So now that in the late tournaments, United States is the most common nation and India is at the bottom. We want to have the same color for each nation. And what you can do is using the scales package to create 15 color codes that we call rainbow 15. And with show col, which comes from the scales package, you can see these, and giving the hex code, we can color our charts in a specific order by giving this vector certain names that are based on the country order total. So United States will get the first color, Russia the second. So now the rainbow 15 vector looks like this. Each color has a specific name, and we can match that to our chart. Because if we index the rainbow 15 vector with the order for early, you will see that Russia comes first, but with the Russia-specific color 58700. And indexing with the late vector, you see United States comes first. And this coloring information we use in the scale fill manual function with the values coming from the country order for early. So now the top red color is not used for the first country, but for the second one, United States. And the green from India at the bottom, you would see that in the early tournament, it's actually third place. And now these charts, if you would put them side by side, would become quite useful to compare to see which federation is present in the early versus late tournaments. You can also turn this information into a map I only want to show you the code and the final result. First, I count for each country the number of times they participated in early versus late. Then I saved some colors that I want to choose. Then I had to add some country information, did some renaming, and then with Geom Polygon created the map of the early participants. So what you would see here is that for early tournaments, many players come from Russia and India, but then also Europe and Brazil, and the US is always strongly represented. And in the late map, you would now see that India has fewer participants and also some parts of Europe. So now I got quite curious to see how often these different federations actually win. So they must place within first to third number. And now you can count how often that happens overall. Here you already see 10 times French players won the tournament. And what we can do is use pivot wider to spread out the winners or the different placements. So now you see the 10 winners from France, number 1, but then also second place 4 times and third place 3 times. And if we do it like in the Olympics, first place is the most important, so this should count first. And we can use the arrange function to sort by this column in decreasing value. So first give me the highest numbers of 1 and then lower it. And when we look at the results, we see that the US comes first with 27 wins, 26 times they placed second and 27 times third. Then you have Russia, France, Norway. That's exclusively Magnus Carlsen. Then you have India, international. And as I said, Mexico, the 7 silver medals don't count as much because we go by first place first. And if there's a draw between Poland and Vietnam, Poland has more second places. So that's why they are overall number 7. And of course I wanted to create this table for early and late tournaments. But first we could create a simple bar chart where we stack the different numbers. So you would see the US, really big chart. And if we in the original counting include the time, we can later use that to facet wrap and split early versus late. And with the position stack reverse equals true, we flip the red to the other side of the chart. So now it goes first, second, third. And we can also add geom text to simply put in the number of wins. And you can already see that the US winnings are pretty equally distributed between early and late tournaments. Now, if you add free y to the facet wrap function, you can get rid of this empty space. You could use the reorder within function that comes from the tidy text package to sort by these different federations and the number of times they win, but it's not exactly the sorting that I want because I want it to sort by first place first, and it doesn't work in this context. But just for a sanity check, I noticed that Germany won 10 times in the late tournaments, but only 1 time in the early part. And we can check that by filtering for country and placement, and then select a certain number of columns and arrange by time and number. And then we can see the winners or the placement, first, second, and third. It's only 2 players, and yes, only 1 time in the early tournament, a German player placed within the top 3. If we do the same for India, where we saw it's much rarer for them to play in the late tournament, we can still see almost a perfect 50-50 split between placements in the early part and the late tournaments by these Indian players. So now for the early plot, I extracted based on the certain arrangement that I want to see. First place first, I get the following federations for early versus late. I store this order, and then I create a stacked bar chart that I will store as early plot. And here I use the GG text package to add some HTML code to color my title. And then I create a similar chart for the late tournaments. This is the early plot, most successful nations for the early tournament, US, Russia, Norway. And then international, which is mostly Russian players that change the federation. India 6th place. And for the late tournament, you can see the legend is in the title. First, second, and third place are these columns. And the late version, India is 3rd place, Russia 5th, Germany 6th. And everyone with a red part of the chart won at least 1 tournament. And if you put these charts side by side, you can have a direct comparison. One last result regarding the federations and their time split. I was curious about the ratio of a nation participating early versus late, and you can use group, count, and pivot to create a number of participants over all the tournaments of 2023, comparing late versus early. And then if you follow this up with mutate, you can create a ratio dividing late by early. So if you're below 1, it means you play more early tournaments. you can calculate specific percent late versus early numbers. So then it looks like this overall. Here, a ratio over 1 means the US participates more in late tournaments, 58%, and in Russia, the ratio is below 1, only 35% of the time they participate in late tournaments. And this is something that you can nicely plot, where I added a line at 50%. And here I asked what proportion of players from each country participate in the early event. And you see a clear shift for Uzbekistan, India, Kazakhstan, all these Asian countries, China and Russia, and then Brazil, US, Colombia, Canada, less likely to participate early. I was surprised by Cuba being above the 50% line, participating more in early events. The last point regarding tournament results I want to discuss is about the titles. It's called Titled Tuesday for a reason. All the players participating have some kind of title, and the most common one is the FIDE Master. I can link to the article that explains how the titles are determined. Basically, it's about a certain FIDE rating that you establish for classical or standard chess, and with 2500 you're considered a Grandmaster. International Master only, quote-unquote, needs 2400 points. That's the IM. FM for FIDE Master for 2300 points, and then there is the Candidate Master with 2200. For the women title, I think it's a deduction of 200 points to make it comparable. And then some federations also give away a National Masters title. And for the US, you get a National Masters title once you reach a rating of 2200. And given that these titles represent a certain order of ratings, it's okay to turn them into a factor with specific levels. So now if we create this column and count, you will see that now GM comes first, even though it's not the most common. And we can turn this into a percentage with the mutate function to see that 16.6% of participants in 2023 were Grandmasters in the Title Tuesday event. 1/3 were FIDE Masters. And then the women titles are a lot less common. If you would extract the gender information from the title name, you could also count and calculate percentages and then find out that 93.4% of participants overall were men and 6.6% women. For the next chart, I wanted to see how this proportion of titles changes for the different tournaments, and I focused only on the top 5 titles. So I filtered by gender for men and calculated for each tournament time, early versus late, how many titles participated. And given that we have the grouping for exactly these 3 variables, date and time, the percent is calculated within one tournament. So this percentage adds up to 1, and then the next one also. And we can use this information to plot the following chart. We could create an area chart again that shows what proportion of these titles participated for the early versus late tournament during 2023. Now this looks like a pretty stable distribution overall. Not too many changes are happening, but it's not easy to find out, for example, what the highest percent of Grandmasters was that participated. So for that, we would show box plots, where you could now see that sometimes in a tournament, only 13% of players were Grandmasters, but sometimes it's 25%. And you can make this chart interactive with the plotly function and then hover over to find out, for example, what the date was. So this was March 21st in the early tournament, where you had 25% of participants being Grandmasters. You see for the FIDE Masters, it ranges between 41%, sometimes 30.6%, but you could also just simply look at the table result. Here I filtered for Grandmasters and then arranged by descending percentage. Next, I was interested in finding out what the average score is based on the title, and you can see the difference that the Grandmasters on average score almost 6 points, followed by International Masters 4.45, and then you see Women Grandmasters performing better than Candidate Masters and National Masters on average gaining 3 points. And keep in mind that these titles are given for classical chess and not for the 3-minute blitz games that are played during Title Tuesday. If you turn these scores into box plots, you can see this pattern. Now I used ordered titles, and based on the player data frame, I plotted the average score of different players. And here you can see that there's a lot of variation still within the Grandmaster title, with some players in these blitz games scoring 7.5 points on average versus some staying around 2.5. Then we can explore the actual blitz rating per title, because every player has a certain rating that's specific to the blitz games. And you can see that the average rating for Grandmasters is 2,855, International Masters 2,600. But then for the other titles, the blitz rating on average is pretty close to one another, 2,200 to 2,500. And we can make a box plot again to visualize that the Grandmasters and even the International Masters clearly stand out. But then there's much more overlap for the other titles. And if I plot that based on a player data frame, you can see each individual Grandmaster and their specific blitz rating clowning around this box plot, which also means that some candidate masters have a higher blitz rating than some Grandmasters. Next, I wanted to know what the most common titles are for certain federations like the US, Russia, Poland, Spain, and India. And I turned that into a heat map where you can actually add the percentages within GM plot by specifying the label to this label percent. And interestingly, for Spain, there are no national masters, but for the US, that's actually the highest proportion. So 56% of titles for the US is national masters. Russia and Spain are really high on FIDE masters, and the highest percentage of grandmasters comes from India, and also international masters, highly represented in India. And instead of the heat map for 5 federations, I was more curious to investigate the top 15 countries, and I created a sub-data frame, FET title data frame. Then I did some reordering based on the grandmasters, and I plotted this as a stacked column chart, where I also created a column called FET_N that pastes together how many players we have for a given country, and I here filtered only for tournaments where a player played 9 or more games and appeared in more than 5 tournaments. And here you see again that the US and Canada and even Brazil has a really high proportion of national masters, and that Armenia, even though it's just 18 players, has the highest proportion of grandmasters participating in these tournaments. So quite an informative chart with the number of players in parentheses below the country. For the last chart that's title related, I wanted to see how often a certain score is accomplished by a given title, and I want to normalize this to 100%, so turn it into proportions that add up to 100. And here you can see that the grandmasters have a really different pattern from the rest of the titles. Almost 50% of the time they score 7 points or higher, which is much rarer for international or FIDE masters. If we zoom in, we see that the scoring category of 9 to 11 points happened to 8.2% of the grandmasters, and only 0.5% or 0.1% for international and FIDE masters. And you might remember that 9 point is the minimum you need to win this tournament. So when we filter for the titles that scored the max score, you see it's almost exclusively grandmasters, but 2 times it was an international master and 1 time a FIDE master. And we can filter for these instances to find 1 player from India and 1 from Iran and an international player scoring 9 or 9.5 points. That's where these small slivers come from. Oh, and the last chart regarding to the blitz rating. Here I just created a line chart that shows that the average rating for early is minimally higher than for late tournaments, but it's around 2,525 points. We can use the summary function to look more into these results. Overall, the rating is on average 2,500, slightly higher for early tournaments than for late ones. And if you want to be better than 25% of players, you need at least 2,373 points to qualify, which you could investigate further by using the quantile function. By default, it gives you these 4 quartiles where players fall into, but you can change the probability to find out that top 90% of players have at least 2,868 points. And if you want to be in the top 5%, you need to have a rating of 2,963 or better. One quick correction before we move to the player-specific results. I claimed that this score category of 9 and above is really rare for FM and IM titles, and then I filtered for this subset, and this is not the true number of cases where this score was achieved, because here I filter for the case where this score represents the maximum score of that given tournament. But if you filter for IMs, you actually see that 39 times a score of 9 and above was achieved, and for the FMs that happened 15 times. And now it's time for part 2, where we look into which specific players won the most tournament, participated in the most tournaments, won both tournaments at the same time, etc. One thing you can do is filter for specific names and then view them. And here you could go through the different columns to investigate how often they participated, what their minimum, average and maximum score was. We have the best placement, the average place, median, lowest placement, winning chance, how often they were in the top 3, 10, etc. The average rating, best rating, and so on. You can also use the transpose function to get these results in a kind of data frame where now everything is in quotes representing text, but now you have all the players as columns and you could compare individual results. So the first thing we can ask is how many unique players are there in our player data frame. The rows represent unique entries for the username, so we have 4,129 players. With the ndistinct function you get the same result when you count the usernames. And then we want to know, on average, in how many tournaments did they participate. And the summary function gives us these 6 values with a median of 6. Some players just participated once. Highest entry is 100. If you're curious to find out which Grandmaster only participated once, you can filter and then arrange by N participations to get a whole list of players that only played one tournament. And maybe one of the most important results would be which player won the most tournaments. So we would just arrange by descending number of first wins. And then we see Hikaru won 18 times in front of Magnus with 9 wins and Dmitry Andrekin 6 wins. I also show the number of participations and the winning chance, which is dividing first place by number of participations, which means that if Hikaru joins this tournament 24% of the times he actually won it. I also show the median score and the average score for these players. If you would turn this into a chart, filtering for players that at least one time won the tournament and then using the federation to fill in a certain color, it would look like this. And since this is a bit overcrowded, I will filter only for players that won the tournament at least twice. And I use the color brewer function with a certain palette that makes the different federations more obvious. So now you see US participants, Wesley So and Nakamura. In this light green, Magnus Carlsen, the only Norwegian player. In gray, you have Russia with 3 players, 1 player from Serbia, 2 French and 1 Indian player. Then I wanted to know with what score they did win the tournaments. And I focused only on the players that won at least 5 times. I created a sub-data frame for these players with a specific name category as a factor that groups all the other players in another category, which you get by using the fct-lum function, and then focus on the top 7 players only. And based on this data frame, I can calculate the percent score for each individual participant and then plot it as a stacked geom column chart. And here you can see that Magnus and Hikaru were the only players that won with the perfect score of 11. Andrekin and Maxime vachier-lagrave won the tournament with 9 points. And then the other players mostly with 9.5 and sometimes 10 points. 10.5 by Nihal Sarin, some of the others, and Magnus Carlsen exclusively. Moving on to the question which player participated the most. Here you can simply arrange by descending number of participations to find that Sergei Sikalgo, International Grandmaster, participated 100 times and his best place was 2nd. On average, he placed 25th and scored on median 7.75 points with an average rating of 2,900. Kata Kamsky does a little bit better when it comes to placement and score. He also has a higher rating and participated 89 times, 1 time winning the tournament. And here I filtered for the top 20 players and added a few more columns to see what's the average number of games they play. And so some of these big participants only play half the games when they do participate. And if you would filter for all the games played, this only happened 4 times for this player and 5 times here. Let's find out how this distribution looks overall now that we focused on the cases with lots of participations. That's not the usual pattern. It's actually most common to only participate once, and then you have this skewed distribution where it becomes more and more unlikely to participate that often. We could turn this distribution into some tabled results by asking specific questions like how common is it to participate 50 times or more, which would be weekly, and also ask what's the proportion of players participating 80 times or exactly once or twice or 12 or more times, which means players that participated 80 times or more are in the 0.5% of all players. Playing only once happened to 19%, 11% participated twice, but almost a solid third participated 12 times throughout 2023. Now, interestingly, if you filter for the players that only participated once and plot how many games they play, you find that most of them actually played all 11 games, so that's good to see. And when I mean most, then that's relative speaking, so 33% played all games, but if you combine these, 2/3 of the players did not play all games. And you can add these percentages with the following code to include them in the column charts. I just leave that here if you want to pause and find out what's happening, how the labels are assigned. And you could look into this distribution as well based on filtering for tournament participations where all games were actually played. And then you have a big group of players that never did that. They fall into the 0 category, and then no one did that for 100 times. So these high participations playing all games become less and less frequent. We can use this categorization of playing all games or the majority or only 1 to 5 and carry it over to the tournament specific charts where we see for each tournament what the distribution is of players that play all games, the majority or the minority of games. And I think that's good to see that the players that join actually most of the time play the majority or even all games. We already looked into the question of who achieved the perfect score and found that Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura did that. And then we also looked into the specific dates to see what the competition did on that day. So now I want to see what the average score is for different participants. And if we arrange by descending average score, we see the following. 8.6 for Hikaru is not the best when we count Evgeny Tomaszewski, but since he only participated once, we can apply a filter. Same for Vladimir Artemiev. 8.6 is a really good score, but it was achieved by only participating 4 times. So the question is still out if in the long run it would be lower or maybe even higher. So then here's the revised score based on players that at least participated 10 times. And then you have the top 3, Hikaru, Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen with this average score. You can see that Magnus sometimes does not finish the tournament and only plays 10 games, 10.2 on average. And the best rating throughout 2023 comes from Hikaru with over 3,300. If you want to see the top 20, Sergei Sikalko with 100 participations actually makes it into the top 20. And here are all the players that participated between 3 but fewer than 10 times, arranged by average score, so that we don't exclude them completely. It's just a question of whether their score would hold up and be comparable to these other grandmasters playing many more tournaments. So you do know that the tournament is early and late, and you can ask who won both tournaments on the same day. And for that, we would count the player name and the date and find the cases where the N is actually a 2, because that means they won early and late. And if we arrange by date, we find in February that happened twice, once by Wesley and Hikaru, and then you have 4 other players that finished first on the very same day. But no one did it more than once. If we extract the dates from this last table and then filter the tournaments for these dates, we can see the actual results and confirm that they placed first with a certain score on the same date, early and late tournament. And now what's actually really impressive, if we filter for participation on the same day, you see that Wesley only participated 3 times throughout the year in both tournaments, early and late, and he accomplished winning in one of these occasions. To show the dates where one player won once, but then only finished second on the later event, which means Hikaru came close to winning the same tournament twice in 3 different occasions. Magnus almost achieved it 2 different times. And the way I found these instances was by first filtering the winners, so we know who won both tournaments on a specific day. Then I looked for placing within the first 2 places twice on the same day. That also gave me a list of dates. And then to find the instances where you come close to winning but not actually won on both dates, I just look into dates that occur in one vector but not the other. So we have all the dates where people actually won both. We have all the dates where someone placed within first and second. And then when you subtract these dates from this, you're left with the instances where someone came close on the same day. Like here, July 11th, Nakamura won the early tournament, but then only placed second in the late one. Next, I wanted to know who had the longest participation streak for the week or the tournament. So participating at least once per week or then all consecutive tournaments. And then next we want to look into the winning streak. So the first thing you have to do is filter out all the players that only participated once, because in order to have a streak of participation, tournaments, you need to at least participate twice. And if these are one after another, that would be your streak. So we have users with multi-participations. So now we can use the tournament data and filter for users that participated multiple times. We're only interested in the username and the week, and this is what we get. And now we can eliminate players that participated twice at a certain week, gets rid of 10,000 instances. And now we want to arrange by username and week to get the following pattern. So this user participated in week 18, 20, 21, and the participation streak we're interested in is the longest number of consecutive weeks for a certain player. So a streak of 5 here. And we can group by username and create a streak column that looks like this. We are interested in the difference of one value to the next. So every time we get a 1, that's something we want to mark as true. And so our later analysis can look into how many trues follow one another. We can repeat that for a tournament streak, where we now actually look at a tournament specific ID and not the week anymore. So now this index runs from 1 to 103 for all of the tournaments of 2023. So now you can see that this player has no tournament streaks because he only played the early or the late version of a certain week, and this would count for the week streak but not for the tournament streak. And now for the calculation, I came up with this function that stores the longest sequence based on for loop and some if statements to track what the actual longest sequence is. And if we use this function on the week streak, you get the following result. And remember, for this player we saw there was the following sequence for the weeks where we had this pattern 21 to 32, which is 5 tournaments one after another, and this would be a streak of 4 because just one tournament is not enough for a streak. So then this would be 1 extra, 2, 3 and 4 extra tournaments, giving you a streak of 4. And if we arrange by the longest weekly streak and then left join with the distinct username to name combination. So if we sort by longest streak, we see that we have 3 players who actually played every week of the year. So the first week and then a streak of 51 additional weeks. And you remember Sergei Sigalko with 100 participations, which means he only missed 3 tournaments, but never on the same day, both of them. So still playing every week. And we can repeat that for the tournament streak to see what the longest streak is. And the one with 100 participations managed to play 76 tournaments in a row, which is quite impressive because you have to play the early and the late tournament for multiple weeks, 38 weeks to be precise. And to find out which tournament he missed, you could use the diff function to look into the sequence of tournament ID and find out where it wasn't consecutive, but then after this gap he participated in all tournaments. And surprisingly, even though Hikaru participated in 74 tournaments, his longest participation streak is only 14, and it started in June, where he participated consecutively from tournament 45 all the way to 59 in late July, not missing a single tournament throughout the summer. So now, who do you think will have the longest winning streak? Is it gonna be Hikaru or Magnus Carlsen or someone else? For this, we have to create a data frame with 500,000 entries, which takes into consideration the tournament and the round a player played, and then the result should be a win. So we're looking for trues following one another. So in the first tournament, Jan Duda started with a winning streak of 7 games after the first win. And if we use the longest sequence function again, on the win column, we get the following result. Magnus won 17 games and Hikaru did this 15 times, which means because you only play 11 rounds in a given tournament, these both include the tournament where they won all 11 games and then they added a few more wins the next time they played, or before that 11 win streak for the perfect score. We can put this result into a histogram to see Magnus here and Hikaru there, to see how unusual it is to get these long winning streaks. Some players never even start to establish a winning streak, but the mode is around 3, so some players manage to win 4 games in a row, and then you have this normal distribution that's slightly skewed to the right. We can do a quick fact check and filter for Magnus Carlsen's result, and then around the row 200 you find the last 2 rounds of the tournament in June were won, and then the perfect game started with 11 wins, and then in the next tournament another 4 wins. So really impressive. For Hikaru, we find this pattern starting at row 561, winning the last round of this August tournament, then having the perfect game with 11 wins, and then adding another 3. And when we look at this distribution of winning streaks, one thing we can do is to show these histograms based on the actual title. So I did this here for Grandmasters, International Masters and National Masters. masters, and it becomes obvious that these long winning streaks are really hard to accomplish by national masters, which is the lowest category of titles, and then the best international master made it to 10 wins in a row. So one thing I noticed when I looked at the longest sequence function again, for the games it actually counts the complete sequence, including the first win. So the players with a 0 never won a single game, so only draws or loses. But Hikaru had 15 wins in a row and Magnus had 17. But for the week streak, it neglects the first week. So this is 5 weeks in a row, which only leads to a longest sequence of 4, because for the games it became true when the value was a W for win, but here it becomes true if this number is 1 away from the previous week. So that's a bit of a difference. The 51 week streak means all 52 weeks participated. It's just that the first week cannot come 1 week after week number 0. So it's not a true. I could afterwards add a 1, or we understand that a streak of 4 represents 4 additional week after the first week playing. Let's talk about money next, because the Title Tuesday tournament actually comes with a prize pool of combined $5,000 for each week. It's distributed in this way. And what we can do is create a prize money data frame that holds the following values, a number and a price associated with this placement. And then we can left join it to our TT tournament data. You can group by name and then add up all the prize money earned for a specific player with the summarize function, and then arrange by these new created total prize value to see which player earned the most in 2023. I had to double the prize money for one tournament in January because of this cancelled event a week earlier, and here Hikaru won this tournament. If you add the prize in the way we did, you will notice that there are many NAs for players that did not place within the first 5 places. And if you calculate the average earnings, it will ignore the NAs. So Konrad Holt participated 41 times, but he only won the tournament once and never placed within the first 5 ranks again. So his average earning is actually 1,000. Same for these players. And what we can do to fix this is create another price variable where every time the original price is NA, we add a 0 for no earning, and now the actual participations are taken into account, providing 0 money, and now the averages become much more informative. And here we see Magnus Carlsen having the highest average earning after participating in 39 tournaments, 23 times placing in the top 5, which came down to $406 on average. If we sort by participations, we see that Sergei Sikalko, who participated 100 times, only made it into the top 5 times, so he earned on average $14.5 with these tournament participations and a total of $1,415. But some players have a really good hourly rate of earning $120, $130 participating on average in these tournaments, which takes 2 hours roughly. We can visualize this information with a chart where we only plot the top 20 players. Here within ggplot, the FCT reorder function comes in handy, where you can quickly sort the player names by the total price that's calculated before, and then also use the dollar function that comes from the scales package to add these currencies on the x-axis, which originally was the y-axis, but we used chorded flip to turn it around. I also wanted to plot the averages, and here you can use the glue package to quickly create a label for the x-axis that includes the number of participations and parentheses. So now you know on how many participations this average is based on. And here you have the code to produce this chart with the average earnings by player. And as I said, the participation frequency is in parentheses. Of course, I was curious again to find out how this average earning might be different for early versus late tournaments. Problem here is when you focus on the top 40 players based on average earning, you get an unequal split for early versus late tournaments because the top 40 players more often participated early versus late. But the solution is to use another group by after the calculations and then use top N based on the mean. So now it will give you for early and late the top 20 players based on the average earnings. And when you plot this now, it's more balanced, giving you the top earners for the early tournament versus the top earners in the late tournament. And if we do this for the average prize money one, we can also do it for the total. And here you get the following result. Now Hikaru is number 1 for early and late tournaments. Magnus was average 3rd place for both, but now giving the total, he's number 2. let us quickly explore what the lowest title or ratings are to win prize money. And you can see that there are a few non-grandmasters that placed within the top 5. The one without a title that placed 3rd, 5th and 4th comes from Uruguay with a rating of 2,898. And if we filter for players from Uruguay, we find out that the only player that won money from Uruguay has a username that's anonymous, and we can see other highly rated grandmasters participating. So it's not really easy to figure out who this player is. The best guess would be Georg Meyer, because he only participated once under the real name. Here are the winners of prize money that are not grandmasters. So some international masters and some FIDE masters. And the only name that's familiar for me was Bortnik, and Mikola Bortnik is actually the older brother of Alexander Bortnik. And now after titles, I want to see what's the lowest rating that ever won prize money. And if you count the name and the rating, you will notice that sometimes one player has 8 different ratings, which makes sense because these can change during the year. And here you can see that the lowest rating that won money was Yaroslav Remizov with 2,750 points in May, finishing 5th place, winning $100, which also means that if your rating for blitz games is below 2,800, you will have a very hard time earning any money in these kind of tournaments. The last player-specific analysis I want to do is figure out the percent winning with white and with the black pieces, and I show you how these charts can be created. But as a spoiler, with the white pieces, Magnus has a winning percent of 80, and the second best is Nihal Sarin, winning 78%. Magnus is also the one that has the lowest probability of losing with white. And then you have Hikaru Nakamura and Daniel Naroditsky, also really hard to beat when they have the white pieces. So I do have the results data frame, which contains each player's wins with white, draws with white, loses with white, same for black, and then the games played with white and with black. Based on the tournament information, for each player we have these numbers, and then I turn this into a long format that keeps information of the overall games played with white and with black, and then also the combined result, what pieces did the player have and whether they won, draw or lose, with the associated percentage. So this adds up to all the results you can have for the white pieces, that adds up to 100, and the same for the results you can have with the black pieces. So this is all the information we need to generate these charts. The rest is just figuring out who the top 20 players are when it comes to winning percentage, and then finding the certain order by arranging by these percentages and then pulling out the name. This player order we will need later. So if you do this, you get sorted values from best to worst of the top 20 players. Then you attach this order as a factor with the specific levels to the data frame that is then used to generate the chart. So then this is just the result sorted by winning percentage with white, but as you can see, the losing percentage is not ordered. That's why I then repeat the whole thing for percentage white losing to generate this chart. Magnus losing with white is 6.3% likely, which is quite different from the rest of the top 20 players. And then there are different ways how to combine these charts. You could use grid extra and the grid arrange function to put them next to each other, or with patchwork this will also work, and then you have them next to each other. So let's repeat that for the black pieces. Basically the same procedure, just changing the color from white to black, finding out the order of the players, producing the charts, and then putting them next to each other. And here you can see that the winning percentage overall drops, of course, playing with black from 80 to 73% for Magnus. And for losing, Hikaru is actually slightly better than Magnus, only losing with the black pieces 13.4% of the time. So that's actually a quite cool comparison, I think, for the top 20 players of these tournaments based on winning percentage with white and black pieces. And the reason why Liam Lee is not included is because for the top 20 players I only considered the ones that participated more than 25 times, because in this way the winning and losing chances with white and black pieces become more stable, more representative. So if you miss one of the top players in these charts that I just created, that's because this is based on players that participated quite often during 2023. To wrap up this video, I want to give you a preview of some more advanced analysis I'm going to do in the next video, so make sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to see those. I will be looking into some more patterns and correlations. For example, how does the average score change with the number of participations increasing for different titles of the players? And you can see that it's relatively stable. International Masters have a higher average score than FIDE Masters and Candidate Masters, and the Grandmasters are above of all of them on average, but here you can see that the players that participate in more and more tournaments throughout the year actually drive up this line of best fit, indicating that focusing on these blitz tournaments increases your average score overall. Then I will further investigate the correlation between rating and average score. It's quite clear that the better rated a player is in blitz, the more points he will usually make, and this pattern is quite consistent throughout the different titles, just that the Grandmasters have higher ratings on average and also accomplish higher scores. We can split this data up into two-dimensional density charts that make it a bit cleaner, but still hold this information of higher rating means higher scores. And when you look at this with box plots, you can clearly see the Grandmasters outscoring all the other titles, but then there's also some overlap of some even National Masters scoring higher on average than the worst Grandmasters. If you turn the rating into a histogram, you can also see this shift of Grandmasters having higher average rating than the other titles, and you can easily add the label of certain players, showing that Hikaru is the player with the highest average score and the best rating. And then I want to look into correlations to predict the score that players achieve based on the rating and the number of games they play and their title. And there's a small tendency for Grandmasters to play more games than the other titles. And you can see that as the number of games played increases throughout the tournament, this connection of score and rating becomes stronger and stronger. That's an interaction that we will use for some linear models, because there will be a tendency to notice that this increase in score as the games played increase is different for the different titles, and the slope is a bit steeper for Grandmasters compared to International Masters and the rest, which means that more points will be captured by Grandmasters compared to the other titles, even though later in the tournament they will often face each other. And then we will visualize this trend with a 3D chart where you can find individual players and their average score and number of games played with the title. All these little balls are individual players. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and then see you again for more chess content and data analysis here at the Data Digest. Bye bye.